On the authoritarian, can you maybe walk us through how you see some of the fear of authoritarianism? And maybe for context, in some of your work, you've talked about the difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. If you wanted to start by briefly explaining what the difference is between those two. Recently, there's been a lot of concern about authoritarianism under Donald Trump, and share your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so in my book, I like to highlight two different ways in which authoritarianism might work. So one would be that some particular person or some part of the government, a branch of the government, becomes unstoppable. It acquires all sorts of power, such that the other parts of the government that were previously thought to share power with it are unable to resist it. And if they try to resist it, they get liquidated. They get thrown out, fired, arrested. They're not able ultimately to put up any kind of fight. Some people are very concerned about this, about one particular person becoming a tyrant or one particular part of the government becoming tyrannical. On the other side, there's concern about an impersonal kind of totalitarianism that's not reducible to any specific person. A system of incentives that's kind of bureaucratic or Kafkaesque, that no person is able to control, and which ultimately dictates what everybody is able to do and reduces the horizons of possibility for everybody. If you're concerned about an impersonal system that is disabling all of us, then you might actually want to strengthen particular people so that they can change the rules and break up those incentives and alter them or get rid of them. Conversely, if you're someone who's concerned about a particular person becoming a tyrant, you're going to want a rules-based order, which handcuffs them and circumscribes their ability to act. So one of the things that creates really nasty, intense conflict is that oftentimes when people talk about authoritarianism, they are talking about precisely the opposite thing. And so the solution, the apparent solution to tyranny, the rules-based order, looks like an attack on democracy to people who are concerned about impersonal totalitarianism. And then conversely, the solution to impersonal totalitarianism, the strengthening of particular people or parts of the state, looks like an attempt to instantiate tyranny by those who are concerned principally about particular players. And this is, I think, one of the deep conflicts between the Democrats and the Republicans and their supporters right now. You have a Republican Party that is concerned principally about deep state bureaucrats, about impersonal systems that are hard to get on top of, that are opaque. And conversely, for the Democrats, the concern is about Trump and about the possibility of a tyrannical authoritarian leader, a dictator figure who takes over the state and overcomes all forms of opposition. These are almost completely opposite concerns. But I think that they both express a frustration with the system and its inability to give either side what they want.
With the current second term of the Trump administration, there's definitely been a push to, for better or worse, I guess, to ignore the rules or to circumvent the rules to quote unquote get stuff done, which is usually unilaterally an increase in executive power. You know, the increase in executive power really has a very long history in the United States. I mean, arguably it's been the case for the entire U.S. history. I mean, definitely since Abraham Lincoln, so definitely for over a century. And then some of the pushback is much more oriented towards, you know, we need to respect the system. And it seems like in the last roughly decade, we've seen the Democratic Party be very institutionalist, we need to uphold the system, uphold the rules, maintain the order. In my mind, I saw this with Biden, feel free to agree or disagree, but that these are in response to each other. What do you think is the right balance between the two? Maybe there isn't a good balance and it's just the oscillations of a crisis. What do you see as the right way to do this?
If you have a problem that you can't solve, this problem of money moving all over the world very easily and it becoming very difficult to divert from policies that are competitive from the point of view of attracting this money, if you're stuck in that situation, having a government that's more dominated by electeds versus a government that's more dominated by career civil servants, neither one of those things is going to solve that problem. Mm-hmm. But part of to be a politician in national politics, to choose to run for office, to decide to do this with your life, you have to be someone who thinks that national politics can be the solution to this. So you have to be somebody who thinks that if you could manage to get the state configured in the way that you'd like it configured, if you can get the nation state oriented the way you'd like it oriented, that would get you out of the jam. So, of course, the politicians think that if only they, or people like them, had more ability to make the decision, then policy would be better made and you might get out of the problem. Each of the heads on the Hydra thinks that if only the whole beast would just follow me, then the problem would be solved. So each of the heads proposes to reform or tweak the system so as to make the system more likely to follow them. And this is also the case, for the Democrats. The Democrats, their interest is more in deferring to experts. So they're more focused on technocratic expert bodies and the view that people should follow them, follow the science, follow the career civil servants who know their departments very well, follow the career lawyers, judges who have been in the legal system for a long time and have a kind of expertise that is meant to come from their being in that position. Just as the Democrats have a vision of how the state should be more responsive to some particular part of it, so do the Republicans, and their focus is on elected officials and constraints imposed upon elected officials by the legal system or by the bureaucrats. There's an old show, old British TV show, Yes Minister, which kind of satirizes this long boiling split between the elected official, the minister, and his head civil servant. And the continuous back and forth is each of the two thinks that the problem is the other one. But of course, the real problems that a country faces are not reducible to a power struggle between bureaucrats and electeds. They have deeper causes that go beyond this. And so the infighting about the procedures that we see that has become completely ubiquitous seems very important to the people who are engaged in the fighting. But in actual point of fact, I think the problem that is causing the frustration is this unraveling of the economic system and this loss of capacity to reliably produce stable middle-class life for large numbers of people. And this problem is not going to be solved by either strengthening the president or by strengthening bureaucratic, technocratic expert bodies. It would need to be solved with a new international system, a new set of rules governing the global economic system. And no one has been able to make those rules. The United States has been able to break them at certain points, like when Nixon took the United States off the Bretton Woods system in 1971. There have been moments where an American president has been able to be disruptive, like Trump trying to start all of these trade wars all at once. But usually what the Americans are able to do is to damage the system without creating a new way of doing business. The Americans can break it, but they can't necessarily put it back together or build something new.
It seems like this is a big factor in creating gridlock, where administrations can't get stuff done. They definitely can't get long-term stuff done because it's probably going to switch to the other extreme, the other head of the Hydra will say, next time around. Or maybe can you walk us through how you view the gridlock in the U.S. system and why you consider the U.S. system gridlocked?
Well, so the American system is particularly prone to gridlock because of how many moving parts it has. So not just the three branches of government, but also all of the state governments in addition to the federal government. And then also there are all sorts of rules regarding how political parties have to operate. If you want to get ballot access in many states for many of the higher up offices, you have to conduct primaries. So your process for picking candidates has to meet certain legal standards. There's an enormous amount, therefore, of offices that have to be contested to try to make the American political system do anything in particular. And if you try to act without having won enough of these offices, then you tend to run into the limits imposed by the lack of having won the offices. This often leads people to think that if only they could win enough of the offices all at once, that all of a sudden the system would perform for them. But that is only the tip of the iceberg, because you then have the international situation that the United States is in. a situation that the United States made for itself gradually over time.
Yeah, I was going to say the U.S. helped create the current international system in a pretty significant
Yes,
way.
it created the set of rules which now heavily circumscribe what it's able to do without paying a substantial economic cost, which will then have political costs. And the American electoral cycle has a kind of political time to it that's very short. Every 2 years, you get the entire House of Representatives up for re-election. That's a much shorter window than you typically see in other countries, where oftentimes the elections will be something like 5 years apart. So when you have elections every 2 years, you have to be engaged in economic policy that is consistent with being competitive in that next election. If you divert from that, then you're going to take a hit in that next election, which is then going to circumscribe what you can do subsequently. So the mechanisms in the United States do make it very gridlock prone. But I think a lot of people then look at that and go, well, if only you didn't have the gridlock, then all of a sudden you'd be able to move, you'd be able to maneuver. I think even if you did have a much more centralized kind of system in the United States, you would still find that the United States would be subject to these competitive pressures brought on by the international system that the United States created. That's what we see all over the world with all the other countries of the world. No matter what kind of government they have, they're all subject to these same competitive pressures. The thing is, because the United States has always been a democracy, making the United States authoritarian and seeing what happens hasn't been tried. And yet there's no stomach for trying that. Nobody wants to try it. If you ask people, what do they want? They will all claim that they're committed, with very few exceptions, to democracy in some form or fashion in the United States. It's only their opponents who will accuse them of being fascists or communists or some other kind of authoritarian statist.
What this reminds me of is the book Democracy for Realists, which is a good book. I don't know if you've heard of it, but any viewer, I think you should check the book out. But I think a core argument of the book is that voters vote not based off of ideology, not based off of what they actually think about the issues or the platform of the party or the politician running the candidate, but based mostly off of whether or not their life is better in the months or maybe year, but usually the couple months prior to the election. So if their life feels better to them, they're more likely to vote for that candidate again. And if their life feels not better, they're going to vote for whatever the other candidate is, no matter which side, whether that's conservative, liberal, whether that person is touting we should make big change or this, that elections are often our lives seem better, therefore we're going to vote the same person in, or our lives are worse, so we're going to vote the other person out. And to connect that, if what you're saying is right about the economic issues, and these economic issues seem separate, like most politicians can't, like a lot of the day-to-day economic issues are well beyond what like a president or a specific candidate can actually do in any office. So it's not really their fault. It's often based off of forces, for the U.S. international forces that are often well beyond their control. But if what you're saying that the U.S. is seeing a very slow declines for the last several decades since the World War of people's economic prospects, then I bet people are more likely to have it worse when it comes to election season. So according to the book, then they're more likely just to vote for the other person. So you're going to see more swings in and of itself if things are in decline. I mean, and maybe in contrast, one of their big arguments for why the 30s was able to see such a big heyday for the Democratic Party was because things seemed to be getting better since the Great Recession, and they were getting better for a long period, so people kept voting in that party that was related to that, which was the Democratic Party. But it seems like then, no matter what, if we're in a polarized environment, a non-polarized environment, we're going to see a constant swing back and forth. Or, yeah, what do you think?
I think the Ackerman-Bartels book tracks one of the things that goes on, which is a tendency for the swing voters to back and forth a lot. Of course, the swing voters have become less important in recent years than they were in, say, the 30s. The focus is increasingly on the fringe voter. So the fringe voter, if they vote, they're likely only to vote for one of the two parties, or perhaps their decision is whether to vote third party or for one of the two parties, or to drop out completely. Yeah. So when you're dealing with that kind of voter, you don't necessarily have someone who is willing to vote for both of the parties in the way that the 30s swing voter would. And that kind of voter has become more important. So activating the base has become more important in democratic politics than it was in the middle of the 20th century. And I think that exhaustion with the system and the going into despair, that's very distinctly a now thing, and something that empirical analyses, which try to go back into the 20th century and look at data, struggle to fully appreciate or to take into account.
Yeah, if you only look backwards, that really does help you understand now, but it can't make you fully understand now. You end up only seeing the present as a manifestation of the past. One question I have for you is, basically, what do you see coming of all this? In my mind, I see kind of roughly three ways for what you're talking about to play out. Maybe there's other alternatives. I mean, one is the collapse view, and there are political systems that collapse very harshly. Like maybe you get invaded. There's powers that have a very clear, they're powerful, and then suddenly, like the Soviet Union, they just collapse. And then you have powers that stick around for a long period post-peak. They've peaked and they're kind of declining, and they just frit around for a very long time. I mean, like the Byzantines and the Ottomans, actually in the same part of the world, but different time, the one replaced the other. It seemed like both examples, like the Ottomans existed for centuries after they had peaked as a power. And then maybe the third one, this is a bit opportunistic. I mean, with your metaphor with the Hydra, so that was an animal stuck in a tar pit. But one thing that made me think about were some plants can actually grow, or in a way kind of similar to how you were describing the Hydra, where you have multiple heads that are sprouting out. And sometimes that can be, for them, sometimes that can be opportunistic. They're stuck in the equivalent of a tar pit, like bad nutrient soil or something. And I don't know if this plant is like this, but it kind of reminds me of my dad trying to desperately kill the mulberry bush in the garden of our old home growing up. Every year it would come back, where it has these competing heads and not much happens, and then somehow the winds change and it's able to gain something. One of the heads is actually able to gain traction, and something about it allows it to actually grow, where you have like this kind of slow decline, and then something happens maybe, I don't know, a couple decades from now, and it reascends. What do you think? Do any of these seem realistic, or do you see a different possibility?
I'm not so focused on relative decline. So my narrative is not that the United States is declining relative to other powers in a manner analogous to the Ottomans or the Byzantines, right? So other countries, the other states that might be thought of as competitors with the United States, often people will think that these problems that the United States faces aren't faced by these other countries, but they are. Mm-hmm. And these other countries' political systems give them different versions of the problem that look different, that are not easy for us to access, in part because the quality of our media coverage and reporting on these other countries is poor, in part because many of these other countries conceal a lot of what's going on internally within their territory, such that it's difficult for us even to know what's going on. So I don't see something like relative decline, not something like the Soviet Union either, because in the case of the Soviet Union, it was evident to people in the Soviet Union that people in other parts of the world were getting much richer than them and living much better than they were living in terms of consumer goods. So we don't have some kind of obvious example of some other country or some other system that's working much better than the American system. So there isn't some reason to defect to a different system. There isn't some reason imminently for us to embrace some other kind of system. Nothing else really seems likely to do anything for us. And there's still all this fear about previous attempts to bring about other kinds of systems in the 20th century. And if we were to try to do that now, wouldn't we just reproduce those horrors and reproduce those consequences? I think people are still largely thinking in that way. So I don't see some kind of collapse. And I don't see some kind of slow relative decline of the United States in comparison with other states. What I see is a whole global system that becomes less stable over time, that is increasingly governed by what will seem to be an emergency, but which will just be a continuation of the same thing, ultimately. So we will have, refugee crises, we will have trade disputes with other countries, we'll have all of these kind of manifestations of frustration and of weaker states in parts of the world where there's a real limit to the state capacity and a real lack of ability to coordinate. Some of those states might collapse or might fall into civil conflict. States that are in places that are being transformed by climate change, that are under environmental pressure, some of them might not ultimately survive the cataclysms and the enormous amount of rapid change that's taking place around the world all the time. But this change masks what is on another level of sameness, which is that ultimately, I don't really think that the United States is either going to lose its position of relative preeminence or regain the capacity to, if it ever even had the capacity, to unilaterally by itself create a world system. So if the United States can't transform the international system by instantiating a set of new rules, and the United States cannot decline to the point at which the whole thing breaks down and falls apart, what you get is, I think, a regression into something like a Cold War dynamic in which the United States tries to pick winners and losers in the system as it becomes less unitary. And in that kind of context, most of the countries of the world are trying to, I think, remain part of the global economic system. They want to continue trading with the United States. They don't want to be isolated or kicked out of the system of international trade. So there is a willingness to negotiate to a point to try to remain in the system. But also the United States is not necessarily able or willing to kick countries completely out of the system of international trade all at once, because this is very disruptive to supply chains and therefore has political costs at home. So the willingness of the United States to really go through with attempting to destroy the international trade system and reconstitute it is limited, which means there's going to be a lot of bluff calling from the states that are negotiating with the United States. And I think what we're likely to get is something that is frustrating, that isn't the United States getting what it wants, but also is not the United States obviously declining and being replaced by some other state or coalition of states. What we'll get is a world system that doesn't really work, but which also doesn't go away. And this possibility that it doesn't work, but won't go away, and that this might go on our entire lifetime. You and I might be dead, and it might still be like this. This is, I think, the possibility nobody really wants to face. Everybody wants it to mean something. They want this period to mean something. They want it to produce either a transformation in the system and in which countries are the dominant countries within it, or the revitalization of the United States. But I don't think either one of those things is going to happen. I think we're just going to keep doing this for a very long time, with some possibility of increased acrimony. My ceiling, the furthest I can really see this going is something like Cold War II. And to be honest with you, I'm not entirely convinced it will even go that far, because in the first Cold War, there was almost no trade between the Soviet Union and the United States. There was a little bit of financial intercourse, but very, very little. And there's such a large volume of trade right now between the United States and China, and between China and the various allied countries. It seems very difficult to actually get to a point where that kind of level of trade has been limited to the degree that trade was limited between the United States and the Soviet Union. But I think what we're most likely to see is some reduction in that trade volume, less interdependence between the United States and China, especially in sectors and industries relevant for defense, but no huge sweeping change in the overall structure of the system. And I would make that prediction at least for as long as I think predictions are any good, which is 20 to 30 years.
I could definitely see what you're saying on a 20 to 30 year time frame. And I think any time frame beyond that things like chaos theory just becomes too hard to say much of anything. It just becomes
we just don't know enough about what is going to happen over the next 20 or 30 years to make 50 or 100-year predictions.
Right. I mean, I suspect in some number of centuries, the global system will change totally. And that's just based off of the fact that global systems have changed over the course of history. And, things are very different than feudal societies. But how, I have no
clue. And I think this is the thing for us to really watch.